So tonight we are beyond excited to have the amazing Adrienne Maree Brown speak with us. We are so honored to hear from her as we begin to imagine radical and unseen futures for ourselves and our communities following the recent presidential election. 2020 has been a tumultuous year, to say the least, and as we come to the end of the semester and the end of the calendar year, we feel there is no better time to come together to envision the futures we want to see for Black people in the United States and everywhere.
So, to introduce our guest, Adrienne Maree Brown is the author of Pleasure Activism: The Politics of Feeling Good, Emergent Strategy, Shaping Change, Changing Worlds, and the co editor of Octavia's Brood: Science Fiction from Social Justice Movements. She is the co host of How to Survive the End of the World and Octavia's Parables podcasts. Adrienne is rooted in Detroit. Adrienne also writes Detroit-based science fiction, which she publishes in various magazines. Her science fiction writing path is grounded in the belief that we must train ourselves to imagine a new possible into being, building compelling futures that makes us want to survive. Her science fiction writing is based in years of science fiction scholarship, reading science, visionary, and speculative fiction and applying lessons and comparisons to political situations in the current world. Tonight, Adrienne will engage us in a dialogue about how we can use creative works to cultivate tangible, radical change in our communities. But before we jump into the discussion, Adrienne, would you care to introduce yourself and yeah, just tell us about your work? And yeah, again, thanks. Take it away.
All right. Thank you so much for having me. Thank you all for showing up for this event. I love being the culminating part of anything. I'm like, oh, yeah, yay. So my name is Adrienne Maree Brown, and I'm sitting here in Detroit, and I'm excited to bring some of the ideas to you that I have shaped my life around. I hope they'll be of use to you. So, some important things to know about me. I am a Black, biracial, queer, pansexual writer living in Detroit, like I said, and I live in Detroit on purpose. So, I was raised in a military household. My dad was in the Army for 30 years. So, we moved like every 2 years, which I think probably set the stage for the adaptable life that I still live. I'm still like, if I can be like, the pandemic has been hard for a million reasons, but one of the main ones for me is I'm like, so I'm supposed to just stay in one place. Like, how long do I have to just be in this one place? That's not how I live my life. So um, I went to Columbia and I was part of the Black Students Organization at Columbia. So I was really excited when I saw the invite from y'all because I'm like, yes, I remember being in the crew and figuring out like who we wanted to come and talk to us. And I was like, this is a level unlocked for me that y'all wanted me to come and talk to you. So I feel very pleased to be here. And I'm a writer, but kind of before I started writing and publishing, the main work that I did was social justice organizing and activism. And I started my organizing as a student. So when I was an undergrad, we were, Columbia is not far from the Bronx, and Amadou Diallo was killed while I was in college. So that was the first time that I was like, we need to take to the streets. We need to stop business as usual. And I started getting into direct action at a young age and feeling like, how do we challenge power where it sits? And in the course of my career, I've done harm reduction, like working with people who are active drug users and sex workers. I helped start a group called the League of Pissed Off Voters. And we actually put out a book that's out of print now. I think I have a copy somewhere, but it's called How to Get Stupid White Men Out of Office. And it was funny because during this election, people were like, is that, where can I find that book? I need that book now. And I was like, yes, that book, we do need to figure out how to get it back in print, but we seem to have pulled it off anyway without the book. But I was really interested in doing electoral organizing. And then I felt the limitations of it. I was like, it's not enough to just engage in this 4-year cycle. I really want to be good at direct action. And so I went to work with a group called the Ruckus Society, which trains people in doing nonviolent direct action. And civil disobedience. And it was one of the most exciting things I've ever been a part of. I was there for 5 years, and a lot of my work was as a facilitator, right? Helping people think, like, how do we bridge between what we're so angry about and how much we need each other and the kind of changes we want to make. And what I learned during that period was every single movement in history that has been successful has had a direct action component. And the only thing that actually makes the elections work and policy work is if there's people who are willing to take action behind it. So I really enjoyed that work. And some of the people who were part of the work at that time went on to found the Blackout Collective, which is responsible for a lot of the uprising and brilliant actions that we've been seeing over the past few years. So I feel great about the legacy that I'm a part of there. And then when I left the Ruckus Society, I helped organize something called the US Social Forum here in Detroit. And we had all these organizers and activists from all over the world come here. And it made me realize that we really, really, really deeply needed to get in right relationship with change and complexity, because what was happening was even amongst people who were like, we're fighting for freedom, we had a very small and narrow idea of what freedom looked like and what the future could look like. And I was like, we need to be training ourselves to be in right relationship with a lot of different ways of being. And I was looking at nature, studying science fiction, reading Octavia Butler, who, if you haven't read all of Octavia Butler's work or any of her work, that would be probably the number one thing I want you to take away from spending time with me today is go read Octavia Butler. She's a Black science fiction writer. She published 12 novels and a collection of short stories. And in her work, I was blown away to see these young Black women protagonists who were interacting with aliens and interacting with shaping the future and taking over everything. And I was like, that feels right to me. Me and all my friends should be running things, governing things. And I realized that my vision had always been to demand and win something from those who did not love me. And that is how I had been trained to organize. And I was like, no, I'm done with that. I'm really interested in actually being a part of a community that's shaping the changes, shaping things, making decisions. So I was still doing a lot of facilitating. I got to facilitate Black Lives Matter. I got to facilitate BYP 100 at the national level. I got to facilitate a lot of the early work of the Movement for Black Lives, the vision, the policy table. So I feel like I've been sitting in a particular place in history, which facilitation is one of my favorite things because you get to just be behind the scenes like, okay, so y'all are superheroes. It's like if the Avengers, gather in a room and then someone's there with them like, okay, what should we talk about next? I'm that person. I'm just like, but they're the Avengers. And you get to see that history is made by all these people who are just flawed human beings, but who are willing to be visionary and take action around their visions. So in that process, I was learning and I was publishing. And I published Emergent Strategy, and I'm going to read to you a little something from Emergent Strategy because it really speaks to what I believe is the Afrofuturism of this moment in history and what I think is an exciting time in history. But I also wrote Pleasure Activism, which I think is a huge part of this victory moment, is how much pleasure has been a part of all the uprising, how much pleasure and dance and song and chanting has been a part of every action that we have been engaging in. And the pleasure of winning something, the pleasure of actually being able to take steps towards a future that's viable. I also have a tiny little book that's coming out right now called We Will Not Cancel Us, that's really looking at how do we bring our abolitionist visions of the future, which is a future without prisons and policing and defunding the police and all of that. How do we bring that to bear on how we are in community with each other? So I stay busy. I stay writing, I stay working. And we're very lucky to live in a moment where you can do 20 jobs and people still take you seriously. So I do 20 jobs. And here's something I wrote in one of them. And this is in the book Emergent Strategy. I'm going to start on page 162, but the piece is called Afrofuturism and Black Spring. And this was early on as we were starting to build this cycle of uprising. Lately, I've been obsessing over the Afrofuturism and justice orientation of slave era Blacks because our situation today feels so terrifying and exhausting and sometimes hopeless. And there's so much trauma and grief to bear. And yet we survived that, not individually, but collectively. And not all of those Black people were Afrofuturists, but to focus on Afrofuturists in the Black social justice tradition, I would note that Africans leaping off of slave ships were Afrofuturists. Slave era parents teaching their babies a foreign alphabet in the candlelit dirt were Afrofuturist. Black women dissociating themselves through to tomorrow while being raped into motherhood were Afrofuturists. Those who raised the children of violence and those who chose not to, all were predicting the future and articulating their choices. Slaves who ran to freedom and slaves who ran to their deaths were Afrofuturists. It is the emphasis on tomorrow that centers the dignity of that seed, particularly in the face of extinction. That marks, for me, the Afrofuturist. And of course, there are the big ones whose names have made it through the erasers of history books into our mouths: Harriet, Sojourner, Frederick, John, Malcolm, James, Ella, Martin, Nina, June, Tony, Octavia. Now it is our work. And the exciting thing about this time is that we are learning to name ourselves, our distinctions, and our solidarities, our Afrofuturisms, developing enough of a common dream language that we can be that much more explicit about the real futures we are shaping across boundaries. We are shaping into existence. We are touching the future, reaching out across boundaries and post-apocalyptic conditions to touch each other, to call each other out as family, as beloveds. Quote, all that you touch, you change. All that you change changes you, end quote. We are making ourselves vulnerable enough to be changed, which will of course change what Black existence means. Octavia Butler, who gave us that philosophical spirit poem Earthseed that I just quoted, is a bridge for many of us between this world and the narratives that pull us through to the next realm, or the parallel universe, or the future in which we are the protagonists. We are creating a world we have never seen. We are whispering it to each other, cuddled in the dark, and we are screaming it at people who are so scared of it that they dress themselves in war regalia to turn and face us. Because of our ancestors, because of us, and because of the children we are raising, there will be a future without police and prisons. Yes, there will be a future without rape, without harassment and constant fear and childhood sexual assault. A future without war, hunger, violence, with abundance, where gender is a joyful spectrum, where my nephew would not be bullied for his brilliant differentness, where each of our bodies is treated like sacred ground, whether we have insurance or not. Visionary fiction, a term that my comrade Walida Imarisha coined, includes sci-fi, speculative fiction, fantasy, magical realism, myth, all of it. In addition to this intentional genre side, visionary fiction intentionally explores how change happens from the bottom up, how change works in collective ways, disrupting the single white male hero narrative. Centering marginalized communities means we are the center of the story as opposed to the sexy and unbelievably stylish sidekick. And visionary fiction is hard, realistic, hopeful. It's neither utopian nor dystopian, but more like life. Imagination is one of the spoils of colonization, which in many ways is claiming who gets to imagine the future for a given geography. Losing our imagination is a symptom of trauma. Reclaiming the right to dream the future, strengthening the muscle to imagine together as Black people is a revolutionary decolonizing activity. So, some reading at you. And I wanted to offer that, to me, one of the most important things about how, as Black people, we envision a future is that we imagine ourselves not just defined by our shared trauma, but defined by something that is older, right? And beyond our trauma. that we start to see that the trauma of slavery, which is so massive, is not the defining characteristic of our people. It's the defining characteristic of white supremacy and this era, but it is not ours. It is not our claim to each other. We have a claim to each other that is rooted on the motherland. We have a claim to each other that is rooted in our humanity. We have a claim to each other that is rooted in the culture that we produce, which is irresistible to almost everyone who comes across it, which is why we shape everything we touch. So those are some things I wanted to start us off with, some thoughts to start us off with, but I wanted to spend the majority of the time in some Q&A and conversation with y'all. So let's talk.
Wow. I just want to say thank you so much for sharing that with us, sharing your work yourself. I'm really moved just by the idea that we are walking on the path laid down by our ancestors who are Afrofuturists, and we too are Afrofuturists. That was really, really empowering to hear. So next, we would like to open up for Q&A. We have a few questions prepared for you, but we would also like the audience members to ask their questions. So if you have a question, you can either drop it directly in the chat and we will read it off, or you can write stack in the chat and we will call on you to unmute and you can ask your question directly. So to begin off, 2020 has been a crazy year, as we all know. There's an ongoing pandemic, a much needed heightened attention to the police violence and murder in this country, and the resulting uprisings that have happened across the country and also the world. And so major progress has also occurred in the Black Lives Matter movement and movement for Black lives. And most recently, we've also had a presidential election, a packed year. And so given all these major events, how have you been getting yourself through this year personally?
Well, I'll start with speaking about last year, because last year I released Pleasure Activism and did a book tour while also doing 10 massive gatherings around emergent strategy all across the country. And so I was really worn out by the year. Like, I was living my best life, living my dreams, like everything I went to, I was like, this is the best thing that ever happened. But even sometimes when everything is all good, it can still be really overwhelming and exhausting. So I scheduled a sabbatical for myself, 6 months to go away and relax and rest and take care of myself. And I laugh about this now, but I often do coaching for people to like take a break and take rest and like take pleasure. And I'm always saying, don't worry, the world is not going to fall apart just because you step away. Like, it's going to be fine. So I step away and then the world fell apart. So it was wild. I was like, I'm going to all the countries. So I had gone to Guatemala, Mexico, and I was in Italy when it was clear that the pandemic was like not just far away and not being contained. And so I think the first part of the answer is getting in right relationship with change. I had to really humble myself to the fact that it didn't matter what I had planned for the year. Now the year was going to be about staying alive and staying safe. And I went to Hawaii. I did a lot of internal work, like talking to whales and crying and just being like, how do I make sure that my life is meaningful, even though I can't do anything that I thought I was going to do? And I don't know about y'all, but like, I'm really good with changes that I create, and I'm really bad with changes that other people like enforce on me. So I was just like, I hate this. And everyone was like, but you're so adaptive. And I was like, fuck that. I wanted to go be adapting in South Africa with like animals, and this is not, I can't get there now, whatever. So a lot of it was just like coming to terms and humbling myself to being one of a species that was in danger, right? I was like, no matter what I want to do, we're all in this. And some of us recognize we're all in it and others don't, but we are all in this. So then the other answer to that is I've been really focusing on love and love in a lot of different ways. So it was very clear to me the moment that I could choose where to go, that I was like, I want to go see my parents. And I was surprised by that. But I was like, I just want to be like all hugged up on with my parents and make sure that they're good and just have some big conversations with them and learn to be patient with them. Like I was just like, people around me are dying. People, my friends' parents are all dying. I mean, I don't know. I think all of you have probably been touched also, but it's just been like, those numbers are real and it's changing everyone's life to have to walk with this much grief. But it also is changing my relationship to gratitude, that I'm like, wow, these people that I love are still here. How can I make sure that we're good? And just humbling myself and being like, I'm not going to try to change you or make you accept something you don't necessarily accept or anything. Like I used to be that. I'm always the person who's like, come on, like, now I'm queer. Now I'm pansexual. Now I'm this. Like every time I come home, my parents like, what massive part of your identity has shifted? I'm like, everything. This time I was just like, you know what? I'm just me. Y'all are just y'all. Like, I know you love me and I know I love you. And that's what we're going to focus on. And we just spent the whole summer like that. And that's what I'm doing now. I'm scheduling love onto my calendar before anything else, which feels like an important practice. Like time with friends, time with my nibblings, which is what I call the children of my siblings, which is a gender neutral term that you can all use, steal, borrow, whatever you want to do. Time with my little baby turtle, who is like sleeping back here right now. Time with my partner, and then time with myself. I think the pandemic makes it hard to remember that you still need to spend time with yourself. You are still living this life. You are still moving towards your dreams. So, and then I'm very inspired by movement right now. I'm very inspired by what we just pulled off with all of the corruption and all of the mess and all the other stuff going on. It feels like movement made it possible for this election to go the way it did. And movement might actually get us a Senate, and movement will help us organize those people to something that actually makes it worth the effort that we put into putting them in office. So all the things.
Thank you for that. I guess just tying into that a little bit and your point on scheduling love into your calendar before
Yes.
everything else. I guess I kind of wanted to connect this a little bit about to your work in like pleasure activism,
Good.
and how we should seek to imagine and create radical futures for ourselves. And I guess in a nutshell, just kind of focusing on how we can decolonize our minds and
Yeah.
really focus on self-care as a means of preservation, kind of hearkening to Audre Lorde. So yeah, I'm
Yes.
wondering how
How?
yeah, how you do that,
Yes.
how college students can do that, how young Black people can do that.
Yeah, this is a great question. So, at the very, very base level, pleasure activism is about reclaiming our whole selves from the delusions, the lies of oppression. And so a huge part of it is just like decentering the colonizer in our lives, decentering the ways that colonizer concepts show up, even in our ideas of pleasure, even our ideas of what we should be allowed to take and have in life. Because there's so much that has been trained into us that's like, you have to work twice as hard to have half as much. You are only valuable if you are producing, producing, producing. That idea is a leftover holdover from slavery, right? If Black people think like I have to constantly be producing without necessarily ever receiving a reward that's adequate to my labor, that's leftover from slavery. So a lot of what pleasure activism about and what I talk to people about is like, you have to ask yourself who benefits from you overworking, and who benefits from you always being tired, and who benefits from you giving all your labor to others, and who benefits from you feeling depressed or anxious or imposter syndrome about your work. And I find when I answer those questions, the answer is never me. I never benefit from those things. The answer is always capitalism or some white man or some corporation or corporations that benefit from me buying things to try to fill the void inside myself that comes from not actually attending to that spiritual center. So the how, in very tangible terms, the first thing I think is to actually envision it. And one of the questions I ask people to work around is one that I learned from one of my somatics teachers, Stacey Haynes, which is, are you satisfiable? And how would you know you were satisfied with your life? And this is an answer that can and should change over the course of your life, but I have found it to be a very profound question, because the first time I was asked, I was like, I think so. I don't know. I can't even imagine that. That was not even on my radar. My radar was, I have to get stable. Like, I have to get enough money to pay my rent. I have to get, slightly respected enough to like keep a job. Maybe I need to get this degree, that degree. And no one had asked me, how will you know that you're satisfied with the life you live and the things you do? And when I started asking myself that question, all of a sudden my life became much more tangible and clear. I was like, well, I'm a writer, and so I must write. And any day that I write, I'm satisfied by that day. And when I finish a book, like when I finished Emergent Strategy, I was like, I'm good now. I could die tomorrow. Like, I am so satisfied with the effort I poured into this and channeling my ancestors and listening to little bees and ants. And like, this is something that no one else would have made. Like, this is my making, my observation of the world. And I feel that way with reading sometimes too. I'm reading Nnedi Okorafor's collection called Binti, which is beautiful sci-fi. And when I read something that's really, James Baldwin will do this to me, Toni Morrison will do this to me, where I'll just read it, I'll be like, I can't believe I got to be alive and read something so brilliant. Like it lights me up. And to keep bringing Audre Lorde forward, her essay is the foundational essay of pleasure activism, but she says that when you've experienced that complete erotic aliveness, like really being present in the moment and feeling your aliveness, it becomes impossible to settle for self-negation, self-despair. Like, basically, we won't participate in our own oppression once we have felt our own freedom. I love that, because I'm like, oh, we're trying all the time to get people to run for something that they've never felt. I'm like, instead, let's give everybody the taste of it. Because once you have it, the taste of it yourself, Ella Baker said that strong people don't need strong leaders. And I think one of the things that gives us strength is when we feel our aliveness. Once you felt it, you're like, oh, that's why the uprisings have gone like they have. Because people get out and they're like, oh, we're not scared of y'all. We're actually not scared. We are powerful, and we're going to tear these statues down. And more importantly, we're going to tear down all the policy behind these statues. Like, it's very satisfying. There's things that are happening now that I was taught would never happen in my lifetime. So that's also something to ask yourself in terms of satisfiability. How far do you want our movements to go in your lifetime? And what are you not willing to wait for? So, yeah.
I guess I see, Quentin, that you stacked in the chat, which thanks so much. And please feel free, anyone else, to do the same. We just had one last question from the e-board before we went into audience questions, however. So I'll ask it right now.
Okay.
So I guess kind of going into what you just literally said about what are you not willing to wait for, and like, what do you want to change? I guess just knowing that you are an Octavia Butler scholar, and you did quote her
Yes,
earlier in your
all the
talk, right? And just in that, all that you touch, you change. All that you change changes you. The only lasting truth is change, and God is change. And
Yes.
just such a brilliant quote. And I think I'm wondering how we can be agents of that change in this continuum for justice, and just kind of how we can incorporate Afrofuturism into just how we want to see our lives and get the most joy out of our lives, and just set this world up
Yeah,
for a better
no
future.
big deal.
No
Like,
big
just
deal.
how do we live right? Okay.
Yes.
So I will say this quote is so important to me that I have it tattooed on my body. Like it starts up here, all that you touch, you change. And it was a game-changing, life-changing thing for me when I first heard it. But when I first heard it, I only listened to the all that you touch, you change. I was like, yes, let me come out here and change everything. And it took a while for me to hear that second stanza, all that you change changes you. So my answer to your question is to really think about, where are you willing to change and be changed? Who are you willing to change and be changed with and by? And that is your political home. That is your loving relationship. That is who you should think of as family. Those are the places where you will expand and grow and become your best possible self. And if you come into a space where the only thing that feels possible is that you're trying to change it, but you refuse to let it change you, then not much will happen there, because you will be stagnant and you might end up in a role of teaching people who don't want to learn, right? Because there's no mutuality. Conversely, if you end up in a space where someone is constantly asking you to change, but they are not changing, whether it's a relationship or an institution or a job, walk away, right? You really always want to stay in a place where it's like, we are changing together. And all the relationships we are in are stronger and better because we are changing together. And then I think about the kind of changes you want to make and how can you practice them in your daily life. So one of the ones for me is, I'm an abolitionist. I want to see the end of policing. I want to see the end of prisons. And one of my teachers in this lineage is Miriam Kaba. And Miriam Kaba put out a book last year called Fumbling Towards Repair. But a lot of her thinking is, one of the things she says is, this country has had 250 years of its current experiment of policing and prisons. And it hasn't made us any safer. If anything, it's made us less safe. We have more people who are actually experiencing the harm of rape and sexual assault and child sexual abuse and robberies and all of it, because it's based on a society that is unequal and traumatizing. So what would it look like to actually give ourselves space to experiment with transformative justice and with getting to the root of harms and trying to end the cycles of them and taking responsibility for everyone in our communities? So that's a grandiose idea. And it's easy to run around and be like, abolition now, defund the police. But then what is the way I bring that into my life? And I've really been sitting with that is, in my own life, I have to give up gossiping the way I used to. In my own life, I have to engage when I find myself in conflict with someone. I have to make sure that they know we're in conflict, and I have to be principled in our struggle. And if I need a boundary, I need to request that boundary and hold it. And if I need a new behavior or a change, I have to be able to be in that conversation. And I have to stop thinking of myself as only a victim of life happening to me, but really partner with life. One of the things Octavia says is, we can partner with God, we can partner with change and shape it. And that to me is like how you make a life that is full of all the things, because all of a sudden you're like, same thing. I'm like, if I want to live a life that is satisfying, then I have to drop in out of my head into my body and learn what is satisfying to my body, right? And I mean, I've been fat since I was 13, 14 years old, and it's now trendy and cute. Like people are like, oh, Lizzo. I'm like, it wasn't. For the majority of my life, it was something that was just like, you had to try to be sexy in spite of, instead of embracing. And I know so many people who have so many things like that, different abilities, the ways that race plays out, the ways that colorism plays out, the ways that sexuality plays out. There's so many things that put barriers between us and actually just getting to feel how good it feels to live in a human body. The body does not know that it's not normal or has some difference. The body is just like, I'm wired for pleasure. Let's get to work. And as soon as you can drop out of all that conditioning, that capitalized conditioning that wants you to purchase your way to looking and being something else, when you let that go and land in your actual life, it's like, here's the things that give me pleasure. And some of them might be orgasms, but some of them might be hot tea or writing a poem or watching really good Ratchet TV or whatever it is. Like, it's finding the thing that does it for you, the things that do it for you, and then organizing your life so that you have as much time as possible to feel good, feel pleasure, and feel really good, deep connections with people.
Oh, Lauren, are you speaking?
Oh, sorry, I was trying to.
I was like, I see your mouth moving.
I was just going to say thank you so much, and that we can definitely transition into audience questions now.
Cool.
I see that we have Quentin was the first person to stack, and then Jessica, so we can just move right on down, and feel free to put your name in the chat if you'd like to speak.
All right.
Yeah.
Hi, sorry I was a bit overeager with the stack. Thank you so much.
Ready.
Everything you say is literally a gem. So just like thank you for existing
thank
and
you.
like saying words because it's incredible.
Okay.
So amidst all that, I managed to come up with a question. I hope I articulate it well enough.
Me too.
Earlier, you were talking about in relation to satisfiability, kind of like questioning what you've been taught. And I find in education, because that's something I study, I find that that's really like a wall that stunts like political imagination. And that's something I've been confronting, even in like my experience in college. So I'm just wondering how you have confronted that yourself and how you kind of get around that in like day-to-day practices to kind of like keep it going, because it's always oh well we can't do that, or oh it's impractical, but it's like according to who and like why isn't it,
Exactly, like who said so? Well, I think my first things is I'll point you to this group that I literally worship called Movement Generation. They have this model, they call it the 3 circles model, and I try to uplift it as often as I can to people, but it says it's a strategy model, but they're like, there's what's politically possible right now, that's one circle, and then there's false solutions, and then there's what we actually need to survive. And a lot of times what happens is the politically possible and the false solutions almost completely overlap. So that's what we see happening with, for instance, climate, right? Where people are like, oh, like climate change, like how about we just do carbon taxing where we just charge the corporations so they can still pollute? And it's like, is it a solution? Like it sounds like a solution, but it doesn't actually address the issue, which is we're all gonna die. I'm like sitting in Detroit and I'm like, it's literally 80 degrees here or something right now. This is not okay or normal. And so carbon taxing is a false solution. So when they broke that down to me, that framework helped me so much, because now when I hear something offered to me as a solution to a problem, the thing I think is that actually going to do anything for us, or does it just sound good? Right? I'm like, it's giving me less patience for the stuff that sounds good but doesn't actually do anything. And politicians love false solutions because false solutions make it feel like something is happening and changing without actually having to commit to changing things and taking responsibility for the future. So that's one thing. The second is, this is where science fiction and reading the work of people who have actually manifested change in our lifetimes is really helpful for me. So reading the Black Panther text, historical text, reading Angela Davis has helped me a ton. Reading about the Zapatistas and what they were able to pull off in this world, in this era. Like, you can go and visit them and see the kinds of things that they have manifested. And I call myself a post-nationalist as a muscle bending project for my mind, because I'm like, I don't think that America, this US experiment, is the best we could do as an experiment for a nation. I think we could do better. And so it helps me to think of this as one layer of some soil that people will look back on like they did to Rome. And they're like, oh, Rome had some amazing things. We learned some stuff. It was also empire, so it had to fall. Empire always falls. Currently, we have been imperial. Our roots are colonial and imperial. And that's how we've been practicing and operating. So it's inevitable that we will fall. The question is, how will we fall? And I've started to ask people that. It's like, what can you imagine beyond these borders? What can you imagine beyond this current construction? what can you imagine that's not just a red, blue, but, you know, can you imagine what it would look like to have a map that was green and purple and fuchsia and, you know, just had other ways of showing up. Um, and I ask people a lot about scale. So one of the things I think keeps us stagnant and debilitated is that we're trying to think of the US, the whole US, and how do we get the whole US aligned? And it's like, it's 140 million people, 160 million people, 180, you know, it's like, it just keeps growing. So I'm like, most of us can't conceive of that. So then I'm like, okay, what is the scale at which you can conceive of making decisions with a group of people and feeling aligned, right? And where do you begin to practice that? And then I always tell people to write science fiction. So I'm like, even if you don't think of yourself as a sci-fi writer, answer the question, what is a compelling future vision to me? Like, what would the future have to have for me to want to go on? And sometimes I'll throw in a challenge, like, okay, so it's the zombie apocalypse. What would have to also still be there for me to like fight zombies and want to live, right? Or there's a meteor coming, like what conditions would have to be in place for me to actually be like, fuck it, I'm going to get away from this meteor and I'm going to try to get on a spaceship. I'm like, what would make me want to get on that spaceship? I wouldn't want to get on the spaceship with a bunch of like white men named Trump. Who would I want to get on the spaceship with? Like what conditions would make it a viable future? And kids are great with that one. I'm like, well, if we had to leave Earth, like what would have to be on the spaceship? They're like so clear. They're like, I can tell you exactly what I need on my spaceship. And, you know, so I'm like, play that game with children in your life and you will find a future or many that are like viable and ones you want to move towards. Thanks for that question.
Thank you so much.
I'll be faster, y'all. I promise.
You're so good. I think Jessica, you're next on stack if you would like to ask your question.
Yeah, I'm not gonna lie. Quentin kind of asked my question, and then you like answered the other part of the question I had. But I
appreciate
also,
your honesty.
Yeah, but I wanted to say, like, I really appreciated what you just said about you know, like the body doesn't know it's not normal and it just like is wired for pleasure. I think that like I've definitely personally struggled with like there's definitely like a right answer and a standard for how you're supposed to do things, and I'm like, I just need to find it and everything will be good. So that was really great to hear, and honestly everything you said has been really great to hear. Kind of tacking onto, I guess, like honestly, I think I might run that because I'm a little flustered now, but thank you so much.
Oh, I love that. Well, one thing I will share, I'm like going to see if I can find the quote that relates to what you just said. My friend Prentice Hemphill, who's one of my favorite thinkers, recently said, perfectionism is a commitment to perpetual self-doubt. And it feels so connected to, you know, what you're just saying about like, oh, there's a right way to be, a right way to say, a right way to whatever. And I'm a Virgo, so I'm just like, perfect as possible. Church of Beyonce, and it's like, no, imperfection is more interesting. Imperfection, like once you release, this is why I think being queer or pansexual or differently abled, I think once you lean in and recognize like that's what you are, it becomes so exciting because you're like, oh, I don't fit into the normal box. Now what's possible? Literally everything, right? Like literally everything. There's so many ways of being. So thanks for speaking up, even if you felt flustered.
Thank you for sharing that quote with us. Wasa, you're up next on stack.
Yes, I am. Hi.
Hi.
I'm so excited to be here, and like Quentin, I really feel like everything is okay. Can you hear me?
I can hear you, but it sounds like you're on a spaceship a little bit.
Okay, let me disconnect my headphones. Okay, cool. Can you hear me better?
Much better.
So like I said, I really just want to echo everything Quentin said. Like everything you say really resonates with me and just makes me want to reevaluate all the things in my life. But so I'm reading Pleasure Activism and have been really, really enjoying it and like enjoying the assignments that you kind of just like drop at the end of works. But I think I've been having this dissonance. Like for me, activism comes from a place of like self-sacrifice and like putting others first. I think particularly like as Black women, like we are conditioned to do that, and it's really difficult to break conditioning, even though you know it's there. And so I was wondering like what your thoughts are, slash if you have any advice on like just like everyday practices or even just steps to take towards like taking that understanding of how I've been conditioned and like breaking that to be able to like truly be a pleasure activist instead of just doing the motions or just reading the literature.
I love it. And what I'm going to have us do is actually the other people on stack, if y'all could go ahead and share your questions, and then I'll just do a kind of smorgasbord answering so that we get all of them in before we go. So I see Jordan.
Should I ask now? Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
If you're Jordan, you should ask now.
Okay, cool. So you said something at the beginning to the effect of looking forward to a future of abundance. And so I was just like wondering what specific examples you have of what that can look like outside of like materialistic abundance, which we've been conditioned to believe is like the true marker of success. So like imagining abundance outside of, a capitalistic structure.
Mm-hmm. Beautiful. I love that question. Thank you. Janora?
Oh, I didn't have a question. I was.
Oh, you just had an exclamation. Sorry, my bad. Okay. Mia.
I think it's me. Yeah. Also, it's Maya. Not to correct you, just want to
Maya.
vocalize that because it doesn't read.
It's
like
totally
that.
fine to make people say your name right.
That's right. I really also want to quickly really echo everything that like Quentin and Io and Wasa have said. Your podcast work, also reading pleasure activism right now, finally, just is so generative and fulfilling. And I'm honestly like, I've been trying to get the words to describe how it makes me feel, but like the ways in which I want to grow to be continually. But I just wanted to ask, as I've been picking up pleasure reading again, if you had a suggestion of what to start with reading Octavia Butler. Listening to you and Autumn talk about her so much, I really want to read her work, but I'm not sure what to start with. So I figured I would ask.
I'll help you.
And then one quick other question was, you're talking, especially in the Decolonize the Body episode, has been really foundational for me, like finding my power as a fat person and like reconfiguring relationships with bodies. And so I was just curious if there was anything that you felt was particularly like really just particularly, I guess, generative, just like I guess, not necessarily that there's one thing, but in that, I think, journey in terms of like looking in the mirror and being like, damn, I rock.
Great.
Yeah.
Got it. Thank you, Maya. Nicholas?
Yeah, hello. My name is Nicholas and I'm a first year student. And I just want to say everything you said resonated with me and I love it. I love it. I love it. I'm currently reading Parable of the Talent and I'm just so into Octavia Butler and Afrofuturism and the whole concept of imagining a space where, Black people were marginalized and we couldn't imagine even through science fiction. Yes. And I kind of have a, and I'm going to order your book, Pleasure Activism, for sure. Okay,
good.
And I have a two-part question. Yeah, I have a two-part question. The first part of it is, what do you think the next steps moving forward should be in terms of imagining and advocating for life without policing? I've just been hearing about defunding the police. I'm all for it. And the word abolition scares people. And I just love to see a world where I can go outside freely without my life being in jeopardy because of the color of my skin. And my second part of my question is, how can we apply these Afrofuturism belief systems to forge our path for Black liberation in terms of change and how we can use that to shape change and have that be our, God and have that be our guiding factor?
Great. Great questions. And last question will be from Savannah.
Hi, hello. Thank you so much for coming to speak with us. I wanted to share first just a personal thing, and then I also have a question, but the first thing I wanted to share is just, I was so excited to come today. I've loved your work for so long, and it was so exciting that you were coming. And I actually got my mom pleasure activism for Christmas this year. Yay. And she was actually just diagnosed with breast cancer, and she was just telling me that your work has been so instrumental in her like acceptance process, and that
Oh,
she feels like this, just this sense that like her life will continue to be pleasurable and fulfilling, like beyond this major shift. So I
yeah.
just want to say thank you for that like gift to my family. I really, it's like your work is so amazing. So thank you. And then my question, I also love your podcast, and I just wanted to ask, and I love when you and Autumn talk about theology and divinity.
Mm-hmm.
So I just wanted to ask, like, if there's anything in particular that you've been feeling like really connected to the divine in, like anything that where you've seen divinity in action in the world, or a practice that you've been really like indulging in that feels really divine. So that's my
Awesome.
question. Thank you so much.
Thank you. All right. Can she do it in 3 minutes? Yes, she can. All right. So the first question was activism equaling self-sacrifice. How do we break that condition? One of the ways that I do it is I have a picture of my grandmother who was a domestic worker that's on my ancestor altar, and I make a promise to her. So it's easier to make to her than it is if I was just trying to make it to me. And the promise is that I will break with the martyring practice, right? Because martyrdom, again, is a hand-me-down from slavery, that the Black woman is supposed to be constantly working and constantly slaving, and that Black people are supposed to be constantly slaving. So it's actually like our responsibility to break that practice. The other thing that really helps me is, there's that quote, we who believe in freedom cannot rest. I have really transitioned that quote to be like, we cannot rest in terms of our political rigor, but we actually need to live as long as possible so that we have as much time to develop that rigor and to develop our analysis and to develop our communities. So that's how I do it, is I'm tireless when it comes to my analysis and my development and my scholarship. And then I'm also like very rigorous about my boundaries and making sure that I rest. And I wrote a piece, I did an interview with Zora magazine. So there's a piece if you want to dive deeper into that one. The next one is examples of abundance outside of capitalism. There's a beautiful essay in Octavia's Brood called Evidence by Alexis Pauline Gumbs. That is a top recommendation that I would go to. It speaks about the abundance of being in relationships where people are able to actually give and receive from what they have. And it's a post-capitalist fantastical piece called Evidence in Octavia's Brood. Where to start with Octavia? Normally I say Wild Seed, which is the beginning of the Patternist series, but in this era, the Parable of the Sower and the Parable of the Talents feel like the more appropriate place because they are written starting in 2024 and very much about this political period. And I'm doing a podcast on the parables with Toshi Regan. So it's like, even if you don't want to read it, you can just dive into the podcast. What is the it when decolonizing the body? Mirror practice. So actually start by looking in the mirror as naked as you can be, as often as you can look, and identifying parts of your body that you love, and keep going until there's nothing in your body that you don't love. Next steps for life beyond police and how to apply Afrofutures into Black liberation, I would look at the Breathe Act. So Movement for Black Lives is putting forward a policy proposal called the Breathe Act, and it has a bunch of very, very precise and very visionary ideas for what it looks like to live beyond the police. And you're right about that language, like the language of abolition scares people, but most people actually, when you start getting into the wouldn't you like to live in a way that people are actually moving towards freedom instead of moving towards prison? Like they're like, oh, yeah, that would be nice. Also, white people in suburbs are like, they live an abolitionist life already. I'm like, you know what it's like to leave your house and not be scared. Why can't I know that? That's all we're talking about. And then the last, divine connection, I would say my biggest divine connection practice right now has been my tarot practice. So I pull a tarot card every single day, and it's my way of saying, universe, give me some guidance. And I post them on my Instagram under the hashtag movement tarot. And I feel like it's so on point, it shocks me. So there you go.
Well, Thank you so, so much for being here today with us and answering some of our questions, and just, telling us more about your work and your inspirations, and just how to channel self-love into activism.
Yes.
So we really appreciate it. I guess just everyone, let's sit with all of these words. And again, thank you so much. I feel like it's so important right now to be imagining, again, brighter futures, radical futures that we may not be able to see in our lifetimes, but our descendants will. So thinking about them in what we do now. So again, thank you so, so much. It was such a joy, such a pleasure to have you here with us.
Thank you.
And
I really enjoyed being here with y'all.
Yes, and have a great rest of your day, week, holiday season. So yes.
Thank you.
Thank you,
I wish that all of you
everyone.
have really beautiful lives.
Yes. Oh, and last thing, can as many people as feel comfortable turn on your cameras? We wanted to do a little group selfie, if that is.
Oh, a groupie.
Yes, I thought that would be kind of cute. Okay. Okay, let's do this. We can also stop recording now too. 1 sec. Okay.